Hello, in this short video we're going to be talking about what age does to the brain, and it is definitely the case that most people will experience some kind of change both in terms of the structure and function of the brain, and then that translating to some sort of problem with thinking skills or cognitive skills. But it's a very different phenomenon to dementia, and I'll go through some of the reasons why that is the case. So most people do experience changes. I must say I've certainly seen people in their mid-90s who seem to be sharp as a tack, and so I'm not sure it's invariable that people will have some sort of change, but it does seem to be the normal state of affairs. And probably the most striking thing that seems to happen to people's cognitive or thinking skills as they get older is this sort of idea of slowing of thinking. So it's as if the processor has slowed down significantly. And there may well be reasons for that I'll come on to in a moment, but it's a striking thing, I think. And it just means that day to day, it's just slower to bring out the facts of things, you're slower to respond to environmental changes and so on. And if you've ever had a quiz contest with somebody who's considerably younger than you, which is a times thing, then you'll realise that it just takes a few seconds longer to actually bring things to mind. So slowing of thinking is a very prominent thing as people get a little bit older. The other thing which might be in some way associated with that is this idea of word finding difficulty, which is often manifest as tip of the tongue moments, so you just can't quite bring the word to mind. And this perhaps is somewhat to do with the slowing of thinking, but it might be something else going on as well. And given time, normally this information will come to mind, and classically, of course, people remember the word after or sometime later on. So we see some slowing of thinking and word finding difficulty. We then often see a deterioration in the ability to remember things. So this is distinct from dementia, which is a much more profound memory loss depending on the cause of it. But it is usual to expect some reduction in the ability to absorb information and be able to pull it out again. One of the distinctions between the impacts of normal age on memory and dementia is that it does tend to be the exception rather than the rule. So you tend to remember most things, but it's just occasional things that you might forget. So people often report, senior moments, and that's exactly what they are, they're moments. So it's not as though it's happening all the time. So that's to be anticipated, unfortunately, as people get a little bit older. There is this evidence that episodic memory is affected more than semantic memory. Now, episodic memory really refers to the episodes in your life. So really your biographical history, if you like, so events that have happened, what you've done and so on. And semantic memory refers more to the facts about things, sort of general knowledge and so on. So you tend to forget the events more than the facts that you perhaps have learned over the years. Other things that we see are a reduction in working memory. So this is a particular part of memory that seems to be reliant on the front part of the brain, and it's that part of memory that actually allows you to hold information in mind, to then sort of formulate a response or to manipulate the information to come up with some outcome that you want. So examples might be if somebody's recited a phone number to you, just trying to keep that information in mind to then sort of dial it up, or even if you get a code on your phone to use something and you have to keep it in mind to put it down somewhere else, that would be an example of working memory. And we even use working memory in day-to-day life when we're having conversations with people. You might be speaking to somebody, or they're speaking to you, and they tell you three things, and you have to sort of try and remember all those three things to respond to them in turn. So that's all working memory, and that unfortunately does deteriorate with age. And then we also have a reduction in mental flexibility, which is almost a little bit of a cliche as we get older, that we tend to be less flexible about things, more rigid in our outlook and so on. Mental flexibility really is actually more about the ability to move from one way of thinking to another way of thinking as well. And in part, this also affects attention, which is our ability to take on board what's in our environment, and also to switch between the focus of our attention one way or another. So these things can also be impacted as well. So slowed processing speed, word finding difficulty, a mild reduction in memory, which is more related to episodes in your life, a reduction in working memory, the manipulating part of memory, and a reduction in mental flexibility in some aspects of attention. So all of these things we kind of expect to happen with age. What we don't expect to happen, just as a matter of the course of aging, is any significant reduction in general knowledge. So your fact base, the things that you've learned over the years, should remain relatively intact. And we don't really expect any major problems with language ability, apart from a bit of word finding difficulty. And then we don't expect any major change in visuospatial skills, which is that knowing where you are in relation to other things in your physical environment. So any of these things are affected, then we probably would need to be looking at causes other than just the impact of age. And then the other key feature that differentiates this from dementia and other syndromes of memory loss is that there's no impairment of daily function. So you may have some of these things, but you should be able to compensate quite well for them, whether it's through the use of sort of memory aids, diaries and calendars, or your phone or whatever, or by just taking more time to, giving yourself more time to come up with the answers to things. Generally speaking, there was no impairment. You can just get on with your life with no problems. Whereas in dementia, the impairment is actually part of the definition. And of course, that represents a very different sort of set of circumstances. The other thing to mention about the changes that do occur to the brain is that they are mirrored by structural changes and functional changes that we can actually see on brain scans. So for the memory problems, for instance, we think that some of this is attributable to shrinkage of this very small seahorse-shaped element of your brain called the hippocampus, which sits in your temporal lobes and is really critical for encoding memories, which is putting a memory into your brain so that you can later retrieve it. So as people get older, their hippocampus does shrink, which then impacts upon their memory. In Alzheimer's disease, the most common cause of dementia, classically the hippocampus is shrunken much more significantly, and that's what causes the memory loss. But we do expect some hippocampal shrinkage with age alone. Then many of the other skills that go awry are probably, they do so because of changes to the front part of the brain, or what we call the prefrontal cortex. And that front part of the brain is the thing that allows us to manipulate information, controls attention, and to a degree helps us with processing speed and so on. So the structural changes that we can see on brain scans, whether it's MRIs or CTs and so on, do explain why we see these cognitive changes.